Chapter 7 examples. In this video, we're going to look at examples for Chapter 7 about activity-based costing. We have first a carpet cleaning company that is a family-owned business. They currently charge $28 per 100 square feet, but they don't think they're actually making money on jobs, especially jobs that require a lot of travel. So they're looking at the implementation of activity-based costing. They've defined their activities and what their activity measures are and how much activity they have for each year. So they look at per 100 square feet. So we want to make sure that we know this is per 100 square feet. Our total cost of operations is $430,000. They've broken out that $430,000 into these categories: wages, cleaning supplies, depreciation, vehicle expenses, office expenses, and president's compensation. Now we look at what our cost breakdowns are and what our 4 activities are and what percentage each part of that cost gets attributed to each activity. In order to create how much cost goes into cleaning carpets, we need to take each amount of cost times the percentages in cleaning carpets and do the same for travel, job support, and other. So we have a chart down here to do that, turn that into cost. So we start with wages. Take the wages times the percentage amount in cleaning carpets. If we lock this cell by adding the dollar signs before the B and before the number, so before the cell reference and before the number reference, we can copy that formula across, and it takes this wages number times each percentage point in the line. So we'll do that with each one of these costs. So cleaning supplies times, we're going to lock that cell and then copy that formula across the line. Depreciation vehicle expenses, office expenses, and the president's compensation. We now have amounts for each of our 4 activity pools. So if you remember from the chapter reading and from the PowerPoint lecture, this other pool is considered common costs. And if we tie back to what we learned in chapter 6, we know that common costs don't get allocated. So we're not going to allocate this column, this other column, to any of our products or services because that is a common cost. But we are going to allocate the cleaning carpets, travel, and job support costs. So first we need to figure out what our allocation rates are. So we have our total and our rates. So 200,000, 100 square feet, or 20,000. So we take the cost divided by the activity measure to get our rates. And we can copy that formula. So we have a cost of $8.05 per 100 square foot. $1.30 per mile for travel, and $29.50 per job. Now we're asked to look at one of their particular jobs. So they're trying to decide how much money they actually made on this job. So what was the cost of this job using these rates that we just calculated? So then if you remember back to chapters 2 and 3 when we looked at job costing, this would essentially be our job costing sheet where we're recording what happened on this carpet cleaning job and how much it costs us in order to charge the customer. So we have our activities. We know that this was 500 square feet. And when we do 100 square feet, that we're going to take that times 5. So the cleaning carpets cost is $8.05 times 5. The travel was 75 miles. So 75 miles times our $1.30 per mile. And the job support is a flat fee for every job, $29.50. The total cost for this job was $167.25. Well, we see in part 3 that the revenue we earned was $140, which is our current price of $28 per 100 square feet times the 500 square feet. So our net loss on this job is $27.25. We didn't make any money on this job. The last question says then, what advice would we give concerning pricing jobs in the future? Well, we can look at several different things. One, we can calculate our cost out per 100 square foot. We take our total cost and divide it by 5 because that was a 500 square foot job. And we find out that the per 100 square feet cost was $33.45. We could go back and analyze other jobs and see if we get similar results. And we could use this information to raise our price from $28 per 100 square feet to a price higher than $33.45 per 100 square feet. Another thing that we can do, as we saw it appear in the information, that the biggest cost is actually from considerable travel time. Another thing that we could do is charge an extra fee for jobs that are a certain number of miles out. So we could say anything over than 25 miles away gets charged extra and decide what that fee is. And maybe at 50 miles, you would add on to that fee. So that is another option that they could look at to make those travel time jobs more viable instead of taking losses on them. In the second example, we're going to look at the difference between applying a product-wide overhead rate or a plant-wide overhead rate, single rate, to products versus using an activity cost to apply overhead. So first we want to know, what is the company's plant-wide overhead rate? So we have total overhead of $684,000. We allocate that based on direct labor hours. So our total plant-wide rate then is 684,000 divided by the total number of direct labor hours we have of 12,000, or $57 per direct labor hour. That's our plant-wide rate. Using that plant-wide rate, how much manufacturing cost is allocated to product Y and how much to product Z? We can So if we have a rate of $57 per direct labor hour and product Y uses 8,000 direct labor hours, then we would have 57 times 8,000. And for product C, we have the rate of 57 per direct labor hour times the 4,000 direct labor hours for product Z. So that cost this is our single plant-wide rate. We can also look at a per unit base. So it tells us that we have 14,000 units of product Y and 6,000 units of product Z. So if we take 456,000 divided by 14,000, and product Z we made 6,000 of. So we get per unit overhead of $32.57 for product Y and $38 for product Z. Number 3 says, what are the activity rates for the 4 activity cost pools that we have? So there are activity rates. So we take the cost of each activity divided by the amount of the expected activity. So for machining, we get a rate of $20 per machine hour. We can copy that formula down. For setups, we get a rate of $500 per setup, $42,000 per product for design, and $25 per direct labor hour for general factory overhead. So that answers number 3. Number 4 says which of the 4 activities is a batch level activity and which is a product level activity. So we had unit level, batch level, product level, and organization level activities as part of the chapter vocabulary. So unit level activities apply to all units. These are our machine hours and our direct labor hours. Batch level activities apply to a set number of batches. Setups are always batch level activities. So a machine setup allows us to create a batch of a particular unit. And in order to change to another product or another color or another design feature, we generally have to reset up a machine. So that's setup as a batch level activity. For a product level activity, this is something that applies to the whole product as a whole. So in that case, design would be a product level activity. Now we want to do our total overhead cost assigned to each product using the activity-based system. So we essentially want our activity measure. Do that down here. Paste. And our 2 products. Now we're going to do what our total overhead allocation and our per unit. So for machine hours, we're going to take our rate of $20 per machine hour times the number of machine hours, so 7,000 machine hours. So we're going to take each amount. So for number of setups, we would take our setup rate times the number of setups. We can also, because we have this information set up in tables in Excel, I can just copy that down and it automatically does the math for me. We can do the same thing for product Z. I'm going to take that $20 rate for machine hours times the number of machine hours for product Z. And I'm going to copy that formula down so it does all of the math for number of setups, 150 times the rate of $500 per setup. Once I've done all of the allocations for each activity, I can add up and see what my total overhead allocation per product is. So now I have 407,000 for product Y and 277,000 for product Z. So we can see if we can compare it to the plant-wide rate that we have about a $50,000 difference, where we have transferred $50,000 of product Y to product Z. What happens when we just use direct labor hour? That's a volume measure. Activity-based costing is a truer use of actual resources per product line. So what happens is that we were overcosting product Y by giving it $50,000 worth of cost that should have actually ended up with product Z. This comes back to when we were looking at the segment analysis from chapter 6. So we see that we're incorrectly allocating cost to product Y that should have gone to product Z. So when we overcost a product, then we sometimes also overprice it. We might have also been thinking that product Y didn't have a good profit margin. And one of the reasons for that is because we were allocating unnecessary costs to it. It wasn't a true measure of what resources product Y was using. So the activity-based costing is considered a more accurate measure. We can look at our per unit cost by taking our total overhead dividing by the number of units that we created. So 14,000 for product Y and 6,000 for product Z. And we'll see that we change the cost, the overhead allocation, by several dollars per unit. So this helps us make better costing decisions and better pricing decisions by breaking up that information under activity-based costing. Now we talked about in the chapter that activity-based costing doesn't follow GAAP. Now that is only if we are combining non-manufacturing expenses with our activity-based costing. If we are only allocating manufacturing overhead using activity-based costing, that does follow GAAP. So that's where it gets kind of confusing. Some might say, oh, I'm not going to use ABC costing because it doesn't follow GAAP. However, the only reason it doesn't follow GAAP is if we combine non-manufacturing costs into it. In this example, we're only looking at manufacturing costs. So it's the same overhead that would go into a system under both methods. It does follow GAAP if we only include manufacturing costs in our product costs. The last number says what percentage of overhead is assigned to each product under the two systems. That wants to know what percentage of total overhead for each product. Our total overhead amount was $684,000. So we take the allocation for each product divided by the total overhead amount. And we turn that into a percent. So we know that we're going to shift percentages because we shifted the overhead from one product to another. So we're going to lower the percentage that product Y gets and increase the percentage that product Z has.